Hi guys, they said no man should ever speak of what lies buried beneath the Ashford estate. Not because it's haunted, but because the truth is too precise, too cold, too engineered. You were never meant to hear this. But you're here now. And something inside you, something older than fear, wants to know. Wants to remember. This isn't a ghost story. Ghosts are what weak men fear. This is a chronicle of control, of how madness was not cured, but manufactured. How 3 women, cloaked in religious virtue, built a fortress in the American wilderness that doubled as a surgical prison for the reprogramming of the female mind. The Ashfords weren't healers. They were architects of identity. And what they did behind those walls was not therapy. It was transformation, through blood, through incision, through silence. Every scream that echoed through the stone corridors of that convent wasn't just pain. It was a signal, a severing of soul from self. And no man in Millbridge truly wanted to ask what the price of peace really cost. Because that's the secret of control, isn't it? You make them think they chose it. 30 years. 600 women. Names erased. Mouths sewn shut by shame, threat, or chemical persuasion. But the Ashford legacy didn't vanish. It mutated. Their journals, encoded in theological jargon and cloaked in Christian metaphor, were discovered a century later by a government archivist with clearance too low to understand what he'd just unboxed. By the time the documents reached higher eyes, it was too late. The methods were already in use. What if I told you that some of what you now call modern psychological intervention was born in that basement? That the sisters pioneered procedures decades before lobotomies were formalized, and even longer before MKUltra used similar language to hide something more ancient. You want to know what the Ashfords unlocked? They believed that identity was a membrane, a soft wall between submission and rebellion. And if you could puncture it, rewire the signals, you could rebuild a soul from scratch. We begin now. Not with the blood. Not with the screams. But with the first lie that made it all possible. This is for your healing. They arrived with forged papers and golden smiles, but their power didn't come from documents. It came from certainty. The kind of certainty that only exists in people who no longer question right from wrong, because they've redefined both. Agatha Ashford stood at the center. Not a nun. Not a mother. A tactician. She dressed in the cloth of the church but moved like someone who'd spent time in royal courts and war councils. She spoke like every word was a blade, slow, deliberate, and designed to cut. The townspeople of Millbridge believed they were witnessing the arrival of devout sisters. But what they were truly witnessing was the implantation of a control cell, a quiet occupation wrapped in piety. Her sisters, Prudence and Temperance, were not merely assistants. They were operatives in a deeper experiment. Prudence had trained in Edinburgh under an alias, in a medical circle obsessed with cranial incisions and early neurological theories, the kind of place where pain was a variable, not a consequence. Temperance, she was something else. Her file is the only one that remains redacted in every known archive. There are no birth records. No immigration logs. Just scattered references in occult journals, describing a woman of uncommon perception, with eyes that could see through the veil. When the convent was built, 200 acres of reinforced stone, steel bolts, and surgical rooms carved into the earth, the locals called it divine. What they didn't know is that every square foot was modeled after an 18th century penal architecture manual used in Scottish reformatories. Not a house of God, a house of systematic deconstruction. You may think this story is about women being controlled. That's only half true, because the Ashfords weren't just punishing deviance. They were studying it. Mapping it. Cataloging responses to pain, isolation, and obedience. What silences a voice fastest? What breaks will without leaving visible scars? Which chemical ratios dissolve memory most effectively over 30 days? Agatha believed in sacred order, not from religion, but from the eradication of internal contradiction. A woman who no longer questioned herself could be perfectly predictable. And predictability, to them, was purity. You're starting to feel it, aren't you? This isn't history. This is a blueprint. A formula you've already seen, in schools, in hospitals, in media. The Ashfords didn't disappear. They multiplied. You're about to learn how. The first patient was a 17-year-old girl named Eliza Ward. She had a voice like thunder and a spine that wouldn't bend, not to her father, not to the preacher, and certainly not to the man twice her age who tried to claim her as a wife. When she refused, they called her unruly. When she spoke out, they called her disturbed. And when she demanded freedom, they called her ill. Eliza arrived at the Convent of Eternal Tears in the spring of 1800. She walked through those black oak doors in chains, not forged of iron, but of reputation. Her family had paid in silver. Her testimony had been dismissed. And in the eyes of the town, she had already been erased. That's the first step of any systemic correction, isolation through social death. The body's not the first to be broken. The story is, she was placed in the lower ward. Daylight never reached her room. Her meals were dosed with compounds recorded in Prudence's ledger as solution 9A, a tincture of ergot, vinegar, and opium derivatives, designed not to kill, but to thin the membrane between consciousness and suggestion. The journals note her resistance lasted longer than most. 12 days without speech. 16 without sleep. And then, on day 21, she began to recite verses that weren't hers. The Ashfords had found their threshold. Prudence performed the procedure personally. A modified version of what modern medicine would one day call a frontal puncture, but this was far more refined. The aim was not to destroy thought, but to reroute it. To sever the rebellious instinct from emotional reflex. And according to her records, it worked. Eliza stopped fighting. She became obedient. Not numb, not broken, but rewired. When her father retrieved her weeks later, she kissed his hand and apologized for burdening the household with her pride. The town called it a miracle. They celebrated the Ashfords. Donations flowed in. The waiting list grew, but behind the celebration, something deeper took root. Eliza wasn't the same. She never blinked at thunder again. Never raised her voice. Never looked at the sky. Something sacred had been stripped from her, and in its place, something artificial had been inserted. The Ashfords had proved it could be done. Will can be edited. Identity can be reformatted, not through magic. Not through madness, but through method, and the world was ready to learn. By 1805, the Convent of Eternal Tears had become something more than a sanctuary. It was now a refinement chamber. Women no longer arrived in silence. They were delivered in wagons, blindfolded, sedated, signed over by husbands, fathers, pastors. Some were daughters of merchants. Others were wives of politicians. A few were simply too outspoken in town meetings. The reasons differed. But the sentence was the same: she needs correction. And the Ashfords delivered. Each new arrival was subjected to what they called the initial assessment. But in truth, it was data harvesting. Temperance conducted interviews that were never recorded in church records, but in ledgers coded with numerals, symbols, and phrases derived from medieval alchemical texts. The questions weren't religious. They were psychological. What triggers shame? What memories create emotional resistance? How do authority figures appear in dreams? These weren't nuns. These were proto-behavioral scientists, decades ahead of Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, or Freud. They didn't guess how to change the mind. They documented it. Every failure. Every success. Every crack in the psyche mapped like cartographers of the soul, and behind it all was Agatha, always watching. Always writing. She believed in the universal formula of control. Break the subject with isolation. Soften them with sensory manipulation. Then reintroduce authority, gently, as savior rather than captor. The subject, now destabilized and starved for meaning, will cling to the hand that crushed them, because it's also the hand that feeds. This, she wrote, was divine reordering. The brilliance of their operation wasn't in the cruelty. It was in the subtlety. There were no public beatings. No whips. No obvious bruises. The Ashfords knew that if the world ever looked too closely, they needed plausible deniability. And so they designed their treatments with the same elegance as a poison chalice, clean on the outside, fatal within. What made their influence more terrifying is this: it worked. Out of the 600 women who entered, over 300 returned. Obedient. Soft-spoken. Devout. They became model wives, silent parishioners, passive citizens. And they preached the miracle of the Ashfords like missionaries, not because they believed in salvation, but because they had been programmed to. You still think this was just a forgotten convent? This was a prototype. A test environment for techniques that would echo through centuries. Into asylums. Into schools. Into black-budget government labs. They began with women, but they were always planning for you. You need to understand something. The Ashfords weren't rogue actors. They weren't anomalies. They were assets. Instruments of a deeper structure moving through the roots of Western civilization like a slow, cold infection. You don't erase 300 women and build a stone fortress in the woods without backing. No matter how devout. No matter how cunning. Behind the curtain, there were benefactors. Men whose names never appeared in parish records but whose signatures laced the forged visas, supply manifests, and shipping crates that arrived monthly at the convent. Crates marked with obscure medical symbols, written in a cipher used by early Rosicrucian societies, the kind of language used by those who saw science not as a tool for healing, but as a ritual of control. One name appears again and again in the hidden ledgers: Lucien Verrill. A Boston surgeon, disavowed by the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1791 for unauthorized neurological experimentation. But Verrill never vanished. He went underground, first to London, then to Paris, then back to America, in correspondence with Agatha under a false name. He supplied the Ashfords with anatomical texts banned by American universities. He mailed them surgical tools months before they existed in public hospitals. He gave them everything they needed to bypass the limits of 19th-century medicine, and for what? Because Verrill, like the Ashfords, believed in the hierarchy of human obedience. That certain souls could be corrected, and others, shaped from the beginning for subservience. He didn't see them as women. He saw them as vessels, capable of being emptied and restructured. And Millbridge? It was the proving ground. There's a letter, barely legible, burned at the edges, found decades later in the locked drawer of a Yale professor's estate. It reads, "The sisters have achieved a 64% reformation rate. Memory suppression is more successful than identity inversion. Next, we attempt generational conditioning." Generational. They weren't just rewriting women, they were planning to breed obedience. You felt this your whole life, haven't you? That something was off. That your thoughts weren't entirely your own. That your choices were somehow guided, narrowed, curated. That rebellion was not punished violently, but discredited, ridiculed, erased quietly. You were told that freedom was your birthright. But you were born inside a framework built long before you arrived. The Ashfords didn't just change women, they helped build the box you're still trapped in. Most history is written in ink. But the real history, the one they never wanted you to see, is written in omissions. In missing birth records, burned letters, patients with no surnames, medical charts with blank diagnoses. That's where truth lives. Not in what they said, but in what they buried. After the success of their early treatments, the Ashfords began refining their techniques, less crude, more elegant. It wasn't enough to merely break a subject. They wanted to sculpt them. They believed obedience could be crafted like sculpture from stone, one chip at a time. The key wasn't pain anymore. It was ritual. Every day in the convent followed a sacred order. Wake before dawn. Drink the blessed tincture. Silence until mid-morning. Scripture copied by hand. Not to worship, but to program pattern recognition. The scriptures were altered. Biblical verses interwoven with phrases from legal doctrines, surgical texts, and early philosophical determinism. Women copied them without knowing they were rewriting their neural associations. By nightfall, they chanted. But not hymns. Not really. These were mantras of submission, designed to synchronize thought patterns and induce entrainment, the neurological process by which minds adopt external rhythms. This wasn't religion. It was behavioral engineering cloaked in sacred garb, and here's the part that should disturb you the most: it worked better than even the sisters had predicted. Temperance, the youngest, made the breakthrough. She discovered that by manipulating sleep cycles, women became radically more suggestible within just 8 days. The key was deprivation, followed by induced dreaming through herbal vapors. In that liminal space between exhaustion and sleep, a voice, hers, would whisper directives, and in the morning, the subjects wouldn't remember hearing anything. But their behavior had changed. Sleep became the backdoor into the soul. Sound familiar? Because a century later, military black sites, corporate training camps, and experimental schools used these same principles: fractal repetition, altered sleep, sacred rhythm, to mold civilians into agents, workers, citizens. You think you're immune? You carry this programming in your rituals now. How you check your phone when you're bored. How you crave validation when you post. How silence feels dangerous. These aren't habits. They're residues. The descendants of rituals born in stone rooms beneath a forest, by women with no mercy and perfect clarity. The Ashfords proved one thing: a mind can be broken quietly, and a broken mind will serve willingly. They called it the Veil Protocol, not in public, of course. Not in sermons or ledgers. It was only ever mentioned in the ash-bound Journal of Prudence Ashford, hidden beneath the floorboards of the convent's eastern dormitory, found decades later, pages sealed in wax, written in a cipher that took codebreakers 4 years to crack. The Veil Protocol was the next phase. It wasn't enough to break the will. They wanted to erase it. To replace memory, personality, and belief so completely that even the subject couldn't recall who they used to be. This wasn't just compliance. This was rebirth, a forced one. Engineered. Controlled. Phase 1, deprivation, sleep, food, light. Reduce the sensory input. Strip the ego of rhythm and expectation. Phase 2, reframing. The subject is isolated, told she's being purified. Her name is taken. Replaced with a virtue: obedience, grace, chastity. Her past is declared a lie. Her memories, planted by Satan. She must repeat this until her voice trembles with belief. Phase 3, the mirror, that was temperance's contribution, a psychological trigger used on the 3rd week. The subject was made to stare into a polished silver mirror, smeared with tinctures that distorted reflection. The voice behind her whispered, "That is who you were. Watch her fade." When the woman turned back, the mirror was gone. She was never allowed to see her face again. Not until reformation was complete. Do you understand what that does to the mind? You are your reflection. Your memory. Your name. Strip those, and the soul collapses inward. The Ashfords weren't torturers, they were identity architects, and the Veil Protocol was their masterpiece. You felt echoes of it in your own life, haven't you, when you look in the mirror and wonder why you don't recognize who you've become? When you struggle to remember what you wanted before the world told you who to be? When silence becomes unbearable and your thoughts default to pre-written scripts? That isn't weakness, that's programming. The truth is, you don't live in freedom, you live behind a veil, one constructed long before you were born, and every time you repeat the words they gave you, every time you betray your instincts to be palatable, professional, safe, you are bowing to the Ashfords. Whether you know it or not. By the winter of 1807, the Ashford convent had perfected a cycle, not of healing, but of harvest. Women entered by carriage, disappeared into stone corridors, and returned as shadows of themselves, compliant, serene, emptied. But beneath the calm exterior was something far more dangerous, a hollowed vessel made to mirror the expectations of others. Agatha had discovered what so many modern institutions would later exploit, that the most effective form of control is not surveillance or punishment, it's internalized self-regulation. You make the subject police themselves. Guilt becomes the warden. Shame, the cell. And all of it done so cleanly that even the victim thinks it's their own idea. But their ambition was evolving. This was no longer just about reprogramming individuals. The Ashfords began to experiment with what Agatha referred to as cross-influence propagation, planting women into influential households, religious communities, even schools, where their modified behavior could subtly shape others. These weren't just victims anymore, they were vectors. And within months, entire social circles began to shift. Ideas once considered radical, complete obedience to husbands, distrust of female intuition, suppression of intellectual pursuit, suddenly became virtues. Not through preaching. Through presence. This was the genius of the Ashfords. They didn't just spread ideology. They spread examples. Women molded by trauma into ideal citizens who, unknowingly, passed their conditioning on to others. Each one a living doctrine, a seed of suppression planted into the fertile soil of a fractured society. And the men? They never questioned it. Why would they? The system was rewarding them. Order was restored. Daughters no longer spoke out. Wives no longer disobeyed. The world seemed stable. But it was a false stability, purchased through the mutilation of identity. And here's the truth that will haunt you: we never stopped doing this. We just got better at hiding it. Institutions, corporations, digital platforms, they all refined the Ashfords' methods. Mirror their language, distort their reflection, then praise them for conforming. Control disguised as choice. Shame weaponized as progress. And the deeper tragedy? You've seen it. In women you've loved. In men who've gone silent. In your own mirror at 2 a.m., asking yourself why you feel hollow in a world that promised fulfillment. The answer was carved into the basement walls of that convent, centuries ago. And it's still echoing. They say evil hides in shadows, but that's not true. Evil, real evil, hides in systems. In procedures. In forms stamped and filed. In uniforms worn by people who tell you they're just doing their job. The Ashfords understood this better than anyone. That's why they weren't feared, they were respected. Because their cruelty didn't come with blood-stained robes or wild-eyed rants. It came with perfect posture, calm speech, and surgical precision. The townspeople of Millbridge didn't see monsters. They saw order. That's what made it so effective, and so damning. Over time, rumors began to circulate. A farmer's wife returned from treatment and refused to hold her newborn child. A merchant's daughter came back and burned all her books, claiming words carried too much power for a woman's hands. And yet, no one rebelled. Why? Because the alternative, the idea that the people they trusted were conducting psychological vivisection behind locked doors, was too horrifying. So they chose to believe the narrative. That the women were simply healed. Saved. Reborn. Even if their eyes didn't quite focus anymore. Even if they spoke like someone was feeding them lines from inside their skull. This is how power survives, not by hiding, but by making the truth unthinkable. And then, the disappearances began. Women who entered the convent and were never mentioned again. No return. No burial. No questions. Their families received polite letters. Claims of sudden illness. Spiritual withdrawal. In some cases, the letters arrived months after the woman had vanished. Always typed. Always unsigned. But always closed with the same phrase, "Her soul has found peace." But it wasn't peace. It was erasure. Every time the Ashfords encountered a mind too strong, a will too unbreakable, they didn't escalate treatment. They removed the anomaly. Quietly. Efficiently. And without a trace. what if I told you that this strategy didn't die with them, that in every institution designed to reform, rehabilitate, or re-educate, there are protocols in place to disappear the uncooperative, not with chains. With diagnosis, not with violence. With paperwork that you've already seen it. In whistleblowers who vanish. In citizens declared unstable. In dissent that mysteriously stops mid-sentence. They learned it from the Ashfords, and if you're still watching, you've already stepped onto the same path. By 1810, the Ashford operation had transcended the boundaries of a convent. What once posed as a religious sanctuary had morphed into something far more insidious, a pilot program for psychological subjugation, executed with surgical elegance under the guise of spiritual reform. Agatha no longer referred to their subjects as women in her private journals. Instead, she called them units. Temperance stopped using names entirely, preferring alphanumeric codes based on behavioral resistance and emotional volatility. And Prudence, ever the scientist, kept anatomical drawings alongside confessional transcripts, as if comparing soul and synapse like interchangeable gears. What they had created was no longer merely a system of control. It had become an ideology. A dark faith rooted not in God, but in the perfection of obedience. And like all faiths, it began to spread. Other towns took notice. Quiet visits were made by priests from neighboring parishes. Doctors from Boston arrived under aliases, offering to observe treatments in exchange for donations. Even a British ambassador, under diplomatic cover, visited the convent for 3 days in the spring of that year. He left with a crate of Ashford manuscripts, and was later appointed to a psychological unit within the East India Company. You see, the methods weren't just admired. They were being replicated, iterated, weaponized. And always in the shadows, far from public eyes. But here's the part you need to understand. The Ashfords didn't believe they were evil. Not for one moment. In Agatha's mind, she was saving civilization. She saw chaos in a world where women questioned their roles, where children resisted their fathers, where instinct replaced tradition. And so she devoted her life, and the lives of hundreds of others, to one cause: total internal alignment. No rebellion. No confusion. No contradiction. Just order. She called it the sacred symmetry of the mind. And when that symmetry couldn't be achieved, the subject was eliminated. This is where it starts to mirror today, doesn't it? Where truth becomes a performance. Where dissent is labeled as dysfunction. Where systems that crush the spirit are applauded as necessary. You're not just hearing a story about the past. You're feeling the echoes of a doctrine that never died. One that mutated and grew, century by century, into a world that rewards silence and punishes memory. And if you're still here, it means some part of you remembers. The first fire didn't start from rebellion. It started from within, a small flicker of instability in one of their most successful cases. Her name had been erased, but in Temperance's notes, she's marked only as Subject M42, highly compliant. Responsive to suggestion. Capable of peer influence. For months, she played her role flawlessly, obedient, devout, nurturing to the newer inductees. But something had survived deep inside her, something the Ashfords hadn't accounted for: residual memory. On the 112th night of her confinement, M42 began humming a tune no one had taught her. A lullaby her mother used to sing before the convent. A small act, and yet, it spread like a virus. Other subjects began to hum it too. Some wept without knowing why. The veil was cracking, not from force, but from a memory that refused to die. And Agatha responded not with compassion, but with cleansing. They locked M42 in a subchamber. Starved her of light. Reintroduced the original tinctures and attempted full erasure. But it didn't work. She began speaking in her own words. Refusing the scripts. Asking questions. The others noticed. Fear rippled through the facility. That's when Agatha made the decision. she will be converted or removed. No third option. But before Prudence could perform the final procedure, M42 set fire to her bedding. Within minutes, flames swept through the southern dormitory, consuming everything: books, records, bodies. She died in that fire, along with 7 others. And yet, something had escaped with the smoke, proof that the process could fail. Afterward, the Ashfords did not weep. They rebuilt. They revised. They rewrote the incident in town records as an accidental blaze caused by a faulty lamp. Survivors were silenced with medical sedation. The program continued, colder, sharper, more ruthless than before. But a fracture had formed, and fractures, no matter how small, are where light gets in. This one spark would travel, carried in rumor, whispered by midwives, nurses, and travelers who claimed to have seen women come back from Millbridge, changed, but not gone. This is why they fear memory. Not because it threatens their control, but because memory is resistance. And the moment you reclaim your past, the spell breaks. That's why you're here. That's why you're listening. Because something inside you is humming too, a sound from before the scripts, before the silence. And that sound? It's your original self, clawing to get out. In the years that followed the fire, the Ashfords shifted tactics. The overt programming, the punishments, the procedures, the mirrors, all of it became quieter, more refined, almost elegant in its cruelty. Where once they had broken minds with force, they now dismantled them with language. Words became the new scalpel. Phrases like, "This is for your own good," "God rewards the obedient," and "You must surrender to be saved," were repeated not as teachings, but as mantras, until they embedded themselves into the very structure of thought. And this is where the transformation became generational. The Ashfords began training reformed subjects to become instructors, not of theology, but of submission. They were sent out under new names, into schools, orphanages, even other religious orders, carrying with them the doctrine hidden in kindness, masked as discipline. They didn't need to lock the doors anymore. They had found something stronger than stone walls, ideological inheritance. This is where modern society took notes, because long after the convent fell into ruin, the ideas persisted. In textbooks that taught children to sit still and raise their hand for permission to speak. In corporate scripts that trained employees to smile through exploitation. In political speeches that rebranded obedience as patriotism. The Ashfords' genius wasn't just in what they did, it was in how deeply they planted their virus into the roots of civilization. And here's the hardest truth, some of you still carry it. In the way you apologize for existing. In how you second-guess your instincts. In the subtle voice that tells you to stay quiet when everything inside you wants to scream. That voice? That hesitation? It's not yours. It's inherited. Passed down like a curse. Whispered through bloodlines. Stamped into cultures. And normalized into invisibility, but now you've seen it. Felt it. Named it, and naming is the first act of power. So if you're ready to do more than listen, if you're ready to shed the ghost script they gave you, then pause this video and comment the phrase, "The veil is not mine." Write it twice. Once for the algorithm. Once for yourself. Because when you speak it, you do more than resist, you awaken. And no system, no matter how ancient or hidden, can survive the mind of a man who remembers what he truly is. There's a reason they start young. A reason your earliest memories, of school, church, family dinner, were saturated with rituals of obedience. Sit still. Be quiet. Don't question. Follow the rules. Not because the rules made sense, but because following made you easier to manage. The Ashfords knew this. That's why they targeted the young women first, because if you condition a generation early enough, they'll carry the chains willingly, and teach their children to do the same. What happened in the stone walls of that convent wasn't just a twisted chapter in religious history, it was the prototype of generational programming. And it never stopped. It simply changed costumes. The teachers became therapists. The rituals became routines. The mantras became media. And the cell walls became psychological, invisible, yet airtight. Agatha once wrote, "The mind unshaped by 9 years of age is chaos incarnate. But shaped correctly, it may serve peace for a lifetime." Peace. That's what they called it. But peace without truth is just sedation. And sedation was always the goal. And so, they refined the structure, made it more palatable, more invisible, more modern. The same tools were passed down through institutions: repetition, shame, identity loss, and substitution of choice with curated options. You don't need to be chained when every path you're allowed to take leads back to the same cage. Look around you. How many times have you been told, "It's always been this way"? That phrase isn't an answer. It's a spell, an enchantment cast to lull you back to sleep. The same kind of spell the Ashfords whispered into the ears of hundreds of women as they erased names, rewrote personalities, and remade them into echo chambers of obedience. The difference now is, the ritual isn't confined to a stone convent in Maine. It's everywhere. It's in your inbox. Your job description. Your news feed. Your own internal dialogue when you think about breaking away, but something in you is cracking, isn't it? Not breaking, waking, and once you wake, you can never see the world the same way again. By the time whispers of the Ashford women reached Washington, the convent had already become a myth, a ghost story told by trappers and lumbermen, half-remembered tales of women who never returned, of screams that leaked through stone on winter nights. But myths have power, especially when they mask truths too dangerous to speak plainly. In 1821, a discreet federal inquiry was launched under the guise of surveying abandoned religious properties in the Maine territory. 3 men were sent. Only one returned. His name was Elijah Carr, and the report he filed was sealed for over a century. Buried beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection, Carr's words were never meant to be read by the public. But someone preserved a copy, a faded carbon duplicate that survived through the hands of archivists who knew what they were protecting. His report was brief, clinical, but in one chilling sentence, it revealed everything. The structure was not a church. It was a containment site. And the methods employed were of such advanced psychological manipulation that I fear they will outlive the stones that housed them. What Elijah Carr found beneath that crumbling foundation was not simply evidence of torture or illegal imprisonment. He found a blueprint. A schematic of human obedience. Etched diagrams of the human skull next to sermon notes. Dreams catalogued in coded journals. A locked chest containing hair samples, fingerprints, and written confessions from women who had been turned into living laboratories. But Carr also discovered something else, something missing. A room, bricked shut. Recently sealed. No access. No air. No exit. And behind that wall, he heard something no rational man should have heard, a soft humming. In unison. Like a chant. Like someone, or something, still performing the ritual that he left that night. Refused to return. He retired quietly, changed his name, and lived the rest of his life in seclusion. But before he died, he told his grandson, they weren't trying to save souls. They were trying to erase them. And they almost succeeded. That phrase never made it into the official record. But the boy remembered it. And decades later, he became a professor of comparative psychology at a prestigious university, where he pioneered early behavioral control studies. This is how the cycle continues, not through open evil, but through the inheritance of silence. You see, the Ashfords didn't vanish, they multiplied, through institutions, through ideologies, through anyone who worships control over truth. The Ashfords never needed to live forever, because their true legacy wasn't their bloodline, it was their methodology. Control passed down not through genes, but through systems. Each generation of power quietly embedding their logic into the bones of society. And what began as whispered commands in candlelit halls evolved into policies, handbooks, slogans. You don't notice it because it doesn't wear a black veil anymore, it wears a suit. A lab coat. A badge. A smile. And instead of locking you in a stone basement, it locks you into routine. Into status. Into a life built not on desire, but on expectation. Look closely at your world, how your schools reward memorization over curiosity, how your jobs praise obedience over creativity, how your media feeds you a steady diet of fear and compliance. That didn't happen by accident. It was engineered. The same way the Ashfords engineered their subjects to repeat mantras until they believed them, you were taught to say things like, "That's just how the world works," or "I don't want to cause trouble," phrases that are not yours, but feel like yours because they've been rehearsed in your bones since childhood. This is what they perfected: voluntary imprisonment. They discovered that if you train a person to believe that their cage is protection, they'll defend it against anything, even truth. And the truly insidious part? They taught you to shame those who try to escape. Just like the reformed women were made to report those who resisted in the convent, modern society turns citizens into informants. You've seen it. In coworkers who silence you with rules. In family who discourage your rebellion. In algorithms that reward bland obedience over wild, dangerous truth. And every time you comply just to stay safe, you feed the system. But not because you're weak. Because you were programmed to think resistance is madness. That's what they feared most, not an uprising, but a man who remembers who he is. Because a man like that doesn't just break rules. He breaks spells. He threatens to bring down the whole delicate illusion. And that's why, even now, somewhere in the heart of this system, there are modern Ashfords. Watching. Measuring. Waiting. Not to stop you, but to see if you'll even try. They always knew the mind was the final frontier, not space, not the ocean, but the human psyche. Control it, and you control everything. Not just behavior, but belief. Not just actions, but identity. That was the Ashfords' true discovery, not how to imprison the body, but how to reprogram the soul until it couldn't even imagine freedom. And what began in the cold stone rooms of a remote convent in Maine has since metastasized into every corner of modern life. But now it wears cleaner masks, therapy, wellness, social norms, safety protocols. It uses the language of healing to ensure your continued compliance. Because if they can convince you that surrender is health, then you'll hand over your autonomy with a smile. This is not conspiracy. This is design. Institutional manipulation now runs through everything: how you're diagnosed, how you're educated, how you're marketed to, how you're punished for stepping out of line. The tests you take in school aren't designed to measure your intelligence, they're designed to measure how well you obey structure. The jobs you're offered reward consistency over creativity. And the news you consume is engineered to provoke fear, just enough to make you look for saviors, while quietly conditioning you to accept surveillance, censorship, and control as the price of order. The Ashfords would be proud, but here's the question that changes everything: when did you last make a decision that wasn't given to you? Not offered, not recommended, but truly chosen from your core, instinctively, unapologetically. If you can't answer that, don't panic. That's not failure. That's your first glimpse at the systemic fog you've been living in. The first real breath of clarity. And once you take that breath, you can never go back. That's what the Ashfords feared most: awakening. Because one awakened mind disrupts the entire illusion. One awakened man can dismantle generations of quiet obedience with a single act of unfiltered will. You've been taught to play small. To be polite. To seek safety over sovereignty. But that programming only works until you remember. And now, piece by piece, memory is returning. Not just of what they did, but of who you were before the veil. There is a moment, subtle, irreversible, when obedience ceases to be a behavior, and becomes an identity. That's when the system wins. Not when it controls your body, but when it convinces you to self-regulate your every impulse. To censor your own thoughts before they ever reach your lips. To doubt your instincts. To fear your own power. This was the Ashfords' greatest innovation, turning rebellion into pathology. Women who resisted their programming were diagnosed with melancholic defiance, cognitive disobedience, or inherited hysteria. Labels that turned strength into sickness. And when society believed those labels, the war was over without a single battle. That strategy has never changed, only the terminology. Today, it's called personality disorder, maladaptive behavior, or toxicity. But the purpose is the same, to discredit your awakening by diagnosing it as dysfunction. You see, truth has always been a threat, not because it causes chaos, but because it breaks alignment. Systems depend on predictability. That's why the Ashfords were obsessed with standardization. Their subjects were not healed, they were streamlined. All unique edges smoothed into silence. And when that silence took root, it echoed outward. Communities became quieter, more orderly, easier to manage. But underneath that calm surface, entire generations were suffocating in invisible cages, taught to mistake numbness for peace. And here's the part they will never tell you: freedom is never granted from above. It is seized from within. No institution, no authority, no benevolent reformer will hand you your autonomy, because your freedom threatens their position. Your clarity disrupts their hierarchy. Your raw, unfiltered selfhood reveals the artificiality of their entire structure. That's why, even now, when a man begins to speak differently, with conviction, with sovereignty, without permission, the system reacts. Not overtly, but subtly. Cold shoulders. Cancelled plans. Loss of favor. Because control doesn't always use force. Sometimes it just makes you feel alone. But here's the paradox that destroys the lie: you're not alone. You're waking up in a dark room full of others who are also waking. Quietly. Desperately. Powerfully. The spell is breaking, and now you feel the tremors. Keep going. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a crown, a title, or a throne. It works through implication, suggestion, atmosphere. That's what the Ashfords mastered. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't shout commands. They whispered, and the world obeyed. Because their authority wasn't based on violence, it was based on certainty. That cold, unnerving conviction that they were right, and everyone else was merely waiting to understand. That's what makes institutional evil so seductive: it cloaks itself in confidence. You see it today in CEOs who smile as they cut lives apart. In politicians who promise safety in exchange for silence. In experts who dismiss intuition as irrational, while rewriting your reality behind closed doors. The voice of the system is always calm, always rational, and always lying. The Ashfords used that voice with surgical precision. Agatha especially. Survivors recalled her as mesmerizing, even comforting. She would speak to the girls in soft tones, calling them beloved, chosen, gifted in suffering. But what seemed like compassion was actually reconstruction. She would repeat certain phrases again and again until they overwrote the subject's internal monologue. Pain is purification. Obedience is healing. You are not your thoughts. Each line planted like a seed, not to blossom, but to replace. After enough repetition, the subject would begin to say these things to herself. That was the moment of collapse. When the voice in your head no longer belongs to you. Do you see the parallels now? How modern systems don't need chains to imprison you, just repetition. Commercials that redefine your worth. Schools that define intelligence by conformity. Social media that equates outrage with meaning. Every voice pulling you away from your own. And yet, amidst all this noise, one sound remains: the quiet hum of your original awareness. The part of you that never submitted. The part they couldn't reach. That's why you're still here, because something inside you refused to go silent. And now that part is stirring, reassembling. Not just remembering the past, but remembering itself. The descent continues. The veil is thinning. The true genius of the Ashfords wasn't the rituals, the architecture, or even the experiments. It was how they disguised indoctrination as enlightenment. They offered healing to the broken, purpose to the lost, and discipline to the wild. And they wrapped it all in silk and scripture. The world still uses that formula. How many programs, gurus, therapists, or institutions promise transformation, not by empowering your essence, but by reshaping you to fit a mold? It's the same structure. Just polished. Rebranded. Digitized. But make no mistake, the intent is the same: erase the raw parts of you, and replace them with something predictable. Something manageable. This wasn't just psychological control, it was spiritual sterilization. The Ashfords believed that untamed human nature was the root of chaos. And chaos, to them, was blasphemy. Agatha called it the wild soul, and she dedicated her life to breaking it wherever it appeared. But what she didn't understand, what every control system fears, is that the wild soul cannot be destroyed. It can only be buried. Forgotten. Disguised. But it waits, quietly. In silence. In suffering. In dreams. The convent's most successful subjects often exhibited strange behavior years later. One began waking up in the middle of the night and walking barefoot into the woods, eyes glazed, murmuring forgotten hymns. Another became obsessed with carving spiral symbols into every surface she could find, the same spirals found on the original Ashford schematics. And one, a woman reintegrated into Boston high society, was found dead in her parlor, having written a single phrase over and over in her diary: "I was never me." These weren't isolated events. They were ruptures, fractures in the carefully constructed illusions. Proof that the soul remembers what the mind tries to erase. And so I ask you, what have you forgotten? Not facts. Not history. Parts of yourself. A decision you didn't make. A path you didn't take. An instinct you were trained to ignore. Somewhere inside, the wild soul waits for you to listen. And once you hear it, truly hear it, you'll realize, you were never lost. You were buried. The excavation begins now. Every system of control requires a myth of necessity. A story that says, without us, there would be chaos. The Ashfords told that story better than anyone. They claimed their methods were the only thing standing between civilization and collapse, that without strict correction, women would become hysterical, homes would dissolve, and faith would rot. It was a lie, of course, a self-serving fantasy that cast their cruelty as heroism. But people believed it. Not because it was true, but because it was comfortable. That's the quiet trick of all control. It doesn't just suppress rebellion, it convinces you rebellion is selfish, dangerous, wrong. And so, obedience becomes moral. Silence becomes holy. And suffering becomes sacred. You've seen it in your own life, haven't you? How authority wraps itself in virtue. How disobedience is branded as recklessness, nonconformity as failure. How doing the right thing often means doing what you're told, even if every cell in your body screams against it. That script was written long before you were born. The Ashfords didn't invent it, but they refined it into a masterpiece, a ritualized inversion of truth, where pain was progress and submission was strength. Their brilliance wasn't in how they hid the horrors. It was in how they redefined them, so even the victims believed it was their fault. Agatha kept a ledger, a black-bound book sealed in a lead box buried beneath the chapel floor. In it were the names of 237 women. Each entry followed a pattern: age, condition, duration of treatment, result. But the most haunting column was the last one. Outcome. The options were simple: returned, retained, or removed. And in small, perfect script beside one of the names, under removed, Agatha had written something different: awakened. Dangerous. That woman was never seen again. You might think this is just a story, a relic of the past. But look around. We still label truth seekers as unstable. Still silence the ones who ask why. Still reward those who conform without question. The architecture remains, not in stone, but in society. And the outcome for those who awaken, still dangerous, but here's the difference now, you are not alone. Thousands of men are waking beside you. Quietly shaking off the sleep. Tearing out the scripts. Reclaiming the wild soul. There comes a moment, subtle, unmarked, when you stop seeking permission. Not out of defiance, but because you finally understand, no one has the right to grant it. That's the fracture point. The unsealing. The moment the old architecture begins to crumble. The Ashfords feared that moment above all others. That's why every ritual they designed was meant to keep their subjects asking. Asking for guidance. Asking for forgiveness. Asking for approval. Because the asking itself was the leash. They didn't need to bind the body when the mind bent willingly under the illusion of divine structure. It wasn't control through force. It was control through dependency. And this system, make no mistake, still breathes. It lives in how you ask your boss for time, your partner for validation, your society for a place to stand. Not that relationships or structure are wrong, but when your sense of self is contingent on external approval, you're not living, you're serving. You're still in the convent. Still whispering apologies to a mirror that reflects someone else's expectations. That's why Agatha's greatest weapon wasn't pain, it was the rewriting of names. Every subject was renamed. Clarity. Mercy. Discipline. Titles that erased the chaos of self. Titles that sounded noble, but stripped them of identity. What have you been renamed by? Reliable. Strong. Reasonable. Low maintenance. Do you think those are compliments? Or are they cages with soft edges? There was one girl, 17, who fought it. Every time they tried to rename her, she would speak her real name louder. They isolated her, starved her, flooded her cell with psalms. But she never surrendered. And in Agatha's final journal, there's a single sentence scrawled in what appears to be frantic handwriting: the name she guards is older than language, and beyond our reach. That's what they tried to kill, not rebellion. Not resistance, remembrance. You were not born to serve. You were born to know. And now you are remembering. And in that remembering, you are no longer safe, not to them, not to any system, but safety is a myth anyway. Every empire, every cult, every institution that ever sought to control human beings had one thing in common: the need to sever you from your origin. Not your birthplace, your essence. The place inside you that existed before language, before shame, before doctrine. The Ashfords understood this with terrifying clarity. That's why their rituals didn't start with discipline, they started with isolation. Days without mirrors. Weeks without speaking your name. Months without touch, sunlight, or familiar voices. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation, the stripping of self, layer by layer, until only a hollow vessel remained. Then, and only then, did the programming begin. It's no different now, only more elegant. Today, isolation comes dressed as modern life. Endless scrolling. Artificial friendships. Lives curated for performance instead of connection. You're surrounded by noise, yet cut off from anything real. They tell you you're free, but your every movement is tracked. Your every thought influenced. Your every desire mapped, sold, fed back to you like a trick of the mirror. You're never truly alone, yet somehow you feel completely severed. That's the design. Keep you disconnected, because a connected man remembers. And a man who remembers his essence becomes unprogrammable. The Ashfords had a phrase for those who resisted full indoctrination: soul fractured, but flame intact. They knew, no matter how precise their methods, some would still carry the spark. And those few were watched closely. Tested. Provoked. Because if one of them remembered, fully, he could awaken the others. And one awakened soul was more dangerous than 100 loyal ones. The same is true today. That's why you're constantly bombarded by distraction, division, and doubt. Because deep down, they know what you are. And they are terrified you might know it too, but you're beginning to see, aren't you, the rituals didn't end. They just went digital. The convents became institutions. The sermons became slogans. But the flame? It never went out. It's still there, buried under decades of silence, routine, and approval chasing, and now, it flickers that if you feel it, if your blood stirs, if your spine straightens, if your instincts begin to hum again, comment below, I remember. I remember. Say it twice, seal the crack. Lock in the awakening. Signal the algorithm. And call out to others like you. There is a silence that follows awakening, not peaceful, but charged. Like the stillness before a storm. That's where you are now. On the edge. No longer asleep, but not yet free. Because freedom isn't a destination, it's a confrontation. And what lies ahead isn't light or clarity. It's resistance. Internal first. Then external. The Ashfords knew this stage well. They called it the second crucible, when the subject begins to reject programming but hasn't yet rebuilt their sense of self. It was during this stage that most breakdowns occurred. Not because the rituals failed, but because the false self collapsed faster than the true one could emerge. That collapse felt like madness. But it wasn't. It was rebirthed. You're beginning to feel that now, aren't you? The shaking ground. The unexplainable anger. The tears that come without warning. These are not weaknesses. These are fragments coming loose, pieces of the old construct falling away. The part of you that played nice. That nodded in meetings. That smiled through betrayal. That apologized for taking up space. It's dying. And that death is not quiet. Because the system built that version of you. Raised it. Rewarded it. And now that you're shedding it, the system will fight to keep you, not with force, but with seduction. It will whisper, you're overreacting. Be reasonable. Just let it go. Those aren't your thoughts. Those are injections, the Ashfords called them echoes, mental implants left behind to prevent total rebellion. Many of their subjects, even after escape, would return voluntarily. Begging to be readmitted. Not because they missed the pain, but because they couldn't survive without structure. That's the final trap. They teach you to fear your own authority. To dread the wilderness of choice. Because if they can make you believe that chaos is evil, they can make you cling to your chains, but listen closely, chaos is not your enemy. It is your element. The original condition of the wild soul. The sacred disorder where creativity, instinct, and sovereignty are born. It's where you came from. And it's where you must return before anything real can begin. You've walked the line. You've heard the echoes. But now it's time to step through the veil. They never expected you to make it this far. Most don't. Most get pulled back by comfort, by fear, by the need to belong. But you kept listening. That already makes you dangerous. Because now, you've seen too much to go back. You've tasted something that doesn't wear a badge, doesn't beg for approval, doesn't answer to any system. And that something, that primal, original force, is you. Not the version they praised. Not the one they trained. The real one. The one that existed before the performance began. But there's a price for remembering who you are. The world you knew begins to rot in your hands. The Ashfords prepared for this moment. They called it the rupture. The point when a subject's internal world split open, not in weakness, but in awakening. One survivor described it like this: it felt like I was standing in a room I'd lived in all my life, and then I turned around and saw there were no walls. Just mirrors. Endless mirrors. And none of them showed my face. That's what happens when the mask slips. you realized the life you were living wasn't wrong, it just wasn't yours. The job, the marriage, the goals, the beliefs, they were assigned. Worn. Repeated. Until they felt like truth, but now, truth feels different. Not polite. Not presentable. It's a growl rising from the depths. A fire behind the eyes. A refusal that doesn't need explanation. And that's what makes the system tremble, because it can't reason with fire. It can only fear it, and now we ask the real question: what will you burn? What patterns, relationships, identities must be sacrificed so the real self can rise? Not in violence, but in clarity. In absolute inner command. The Ashfords tried to contain this fire by naming it madness. But it wasn't madness. It was the return of the original signal, the soul before programming, and that signal is coming back online. You're not just learning history now. You're living prophecy. The kind of prophecy that was forbidden, hunted, buried, not because it was false, but because it could set men free. We are not done. Not even close. There is a reason power cloaks itself in benevolence. If it revealed its true face too early, you'd resist it. But if it pretends to protect you, to feed you, heal you, educate you, it becomes much harder to see the chains. That's what made the Ashfords so lethal. They didn't rule by terror. They ruled by trust. Their victims walked willingly into their hands, convinced they were being saved. That's how real control works, not by fear, but by gratitude. By giving you just enough comfort to keep you loyal, and just enough fear to keep you obedient. Think about it. How many of the systems in your life have demanded your allegiance by offering you safety? Your job. Your government. Even your relationships. Stay here, and we'll protect you. Step out of line, and you'll be alone. That's the trade they offer. Belonging in exchange for silence. But what they never tell you is that the moment you accept that trade, you vanish. Not physically, but spiritually. The part of you that questions, hungers, rages, creates, that part goes dark. And they call that maturity. The Ashfords called it spiritual conversion. But what they meant was collapse. A complete rewiring of identity until the subject could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the doctrine. They celebrated it as a breakthrough. But the eyes always told the truth. Dull. Unfocused. Lost. And yet, society welcomed these women back as reformed. Polished. Quiet. Productive. The truth? They were just gone, and now we turn the mirror on you. How much of your life is performance? How many of your choices were made for someone else's comfort? How much of your soul was trained into silence just to survive? You didn't fail. You adapted. But now the adaptation is killing you. Slowly. Softly. Suffocating you in routines that feel like responsibility but are really just rituals of containment. The Ashfords are gone. But their legacy lives in every system that tells you to betray yourself in order to be good. You were not born to be good, you were born to be true, and the world you were meant to build will never emerge until you stop pretending and start unleashing. Now comes the threshold. Confrontation is not violence. It is not chaos. It is the moment when truth stops whispering and starts roaring. That is where we are now. No more shadows. No more metaphors. Because at this point in the descent, the question is no longer what happened to them, it's what's happening to you. You see, the Ashfords were never just historical figures. They were archetypes. Embodiments of a principle that has echoed through every era. Dominate the mind, and the body will follow. They perfected it in isolation. But what they built was a prototype. A blueprint for scalable control, and it worked. You see it every day. In systems that don't need guards or cages, because they've already colonized your choices. You believe you're free because the bars are invisible. But freedom isn't about options. It's about origin. Who made this decision? Who shaped this belief? If the answer isn't you, if it was installed by fear, by reward, by shame, then it isn't a choice. It's a program. And until you confront the source code, you'll keep calling your prison a sanctuary. The Ashfords understood that. They never forced transformation. They simply applied pressure until their subjects broke themselves. That's what most modern systems do. Push you to the edge, and let you become the enforcer. You internalize the voice that tells you to stay quiet, stay humble, stay grateful. Even when your soul is burning for something else. That's the final victory of control, not when it silences you, but when it makes you silence yourself. But here's what they never planned for: a man who stops asking permission. A man who remembers. A man who wakes up one day and says, I don't need this role, this ritual, this reward, because none of it is mine. That man cannot be programmed. He cannot be contained. Because he no longer fears disapproval, he fears disconnection from his truth. That's where your power begins. Not in defiance, but in the unshakable recognition that you were never meant to be manageable. You were meant to be sovereign, and that recognition, it's spreading. Comment it now, again, louder. I remember. I remember. Let it ring. Let them feel it. The fire inside you isn't rage. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's recognition, the soul realizing it has been caged and deciding, finally, to expand. You're becoming something else entirely. The counterforce, reckoning, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like a door creaking open behind you. A question whispered in a voice that sounds like your own. What if your whole life has been shaped by someone else's fear? Sit with that. Not as a metaphor, but as a diagnosis. Because if fear built your foundation, every brick above it is compromised. Every choice touched by that infection. That's what the Ashfords relied on, fear so deep it became invisible. Fear disguised as duty. As politeness. As morality. Women entered that stone fortress not screaming, but grateful, convinced they were broken and about to be healed. But what they were entering was not sanctuary. It was erasure. We live in a world that still calls that process by noble names: rehabilitation, education, compliance. But what it really means is this: forget who you were. Become who we need. And that need? It always serves the system. Never the soul. Now the reckoning is this: are you willing to see how deeply that same architecture has shaped you? Not in the dramatic moments, but in the subtle ones. The pauses before you speak. The tension in your shoulders when you say, yes, but mean, no, the way you censor your own thoughts before they ever reach your tongue. You think that's just personality? No. That's conditioning, and once you name it, you can no longer live under it. You begin to excavate. To burn the false parts out. That's where the pain begins, but also where the power begins. Because under all the performance, the politeness, the fear, there is a man. Not a persona. A presence. One that does not ask for permission, does not justify his instincts, does not abandon himself for approval. And once that man stands up inside you, even if your life burns down around him, you will never bow again. That's the reckoning. Not with others. With yourself. With the truth that no one is coming to save you. Because you are the fire. And no one is coming, because no one needs to. You're already here. The descent was necessary, to burn the false self, to unlearn the lies, to confront the hidden architecture of your cage. But the journey doesn't end in the ashes. It ends with return. Not to who you were, but to who you've always been underneath the programming. This is the most dangerous phase of all. Because now you carry something the system can't measure, can't own, can't market: clarity. And clarity, when worn by a man with presence, becomes a weapon. A frequency. A mirror that forces the world to see itself clearly, and many will hate you for it. You've now become what the Ashfords feared most: a returned soul. They knew that once a subject remembered her inner name, her original frequency, she became impossible to control. It wasn't about strength. It was about alignment. And alignment makes you immovable. Not loud. Not angry. Just undeniable. That's what real men carry. Not bravado, but essence. A signal that can't be replicated or suppressed. Now comes your return to the surface. Back into a world that has no idea you've changed. That still speaks the old language. Still offers the old deals. Still plays the old game. But here's the difference, you no longer do. You walk differently. You speak more slowly. You no longer explain yourself to anyone. Why? Because a sovereign man doesn't sell his truth for belonging. He carries it, like a flame cupped in both hands. And wherever he goes, the temperature changes. That's how power works now. Not in control over others, but in command of self. You don't need a title, a following, a certificate. You need only one thing, presence that cannot be outsourced. The Ashfords are gone. But their legacy isn't. It lives in every institution that punishes the wild soul. But now, so do you. You are the disruption, you are the answer they never wanted to exist, you are the return of the unprogrammed, and now, your presence will do what sermons never could, awaken others. That if you're ready to complete the ritual, to step fully into the final descent, the final unveiling, then we move forward. Revelation is never about learning something new. It's about finally seeing what was always there, hidden in plain sight. That's what makes it so devastating. Because the moment you see clearly, you also see everything you tolerated, ignored, and excused. That's the wound no man escapes, the moment he realizes he knew, somewhere deep down, and still played along. Not because he was stupid, but because he was conditioned. Rewarded for blindness. Punished for instinct. Trained, like a loyal animal, to obey his own betrayal. The Ashfords weren't monsters because they lied. They were monsters because they created an environment where truth became unbearable. And every system that descends from theirs, whether cloaked in medicine, religion, education, or therapy, uses the same equation. If the truth hurts, then silence must be salvation. But now you know, silence isn't peace. It's consent. And your silence has been stolen for long enough. This is your revelation. You were not meant to be digestible. You were not meant to be understood by systems built on fear. You were not meant to be a refined man. You were meant to be a real one. A man who moves without apology. Who speaks only when necessary, and when he does, his words rearrange the room. A man whose presence disrupts programming just by standing still. You are not here to argue. You are not here to explain. You are here to transmit. And every interaction, every glance, every decision from this moment forward, will carry that transmission. Do you feel it, that quiet pressure in your chest? That's not anxiety. That's weight. The weight of remembering who you are. And now, the final question. What will you do with it? Because revelation is useless if it doesn't lead to embodiment. The world doesn't need more men with opinions. It needs pillars. Men whose very existence gives others permission to rise. Embodiment is where everything changes, not because you know the truth, but because you live it. Every step, every breath, every word becomes aligned. There is no more performance, no more internal negotiation. Just presence. Just clarity. Just command. And when a man reaches this point, the world begins to respond differently. People won't understand it. Some will be drawn to it. Others will try to break it. But all will feel it, because a man in full embodiment disrupts the invisible order. He doesn't need to overthrow it. His existence is already the rebellion. You are no longer a seeker, you are no longer a student, you are now the signal. That's what the Ashfords could never destroy. Not truth. Not rebellion. Not even resistance. What they could not kill, what they feared the most, was embodied clarity. The rare, irreversible state when a soul returns to the body and says, I decide now. From here, there is no return to numbness. You may still grieve the old life, the comfort, the roles, the illusions, but you will never again betray the truth that rose from your bones. You will speak less, but every word will strike deeper. You will love differently, with fire, not fear. You will no longer ask, do they approve? Instead, you will ask, is this aligned? This is not the end of a story, this is the activation of a man, you are the aftershock of 1,000 forgotten truths. You are the return of the ungoverned soul. You carry the frequency of ancient defiance, not reckless, but deliberate. Refined. Unshakable, and now, you will move through the world with one mission, to ignite. Not to preach. Not to convert. But to exist so fully, so honestly, so unapologetically, that every room you enter remembers what real presence feels like. This is your covenant now, no more masks. No more waiting. No more shrinking, only this, I remember. I remember, let them hear it again. Speak it below, and let this transmission pass through you, into the world that needs you awake. The Ashford family's story ends here, but yours has just begun.